This year at Mind and Life Europe, we are paying tribute to two anniversaries, the 20th anniversary of Francisco's passing in 2001, and the 30th of the publication of The Embodied Mind. Hence, the overall title of our program is Embodiment and an Action, Varela and Friends 2030. It was on May 28, 2001, when our dear friend, co-founder of Mind and Life, Francisco Varela, passed away. In June, we launched a new webinar series within the overall program, spanning throughout the rest of the year, titled Francisco and Friends, an Embodiment of Relationship. In this series, Francisco's friends, colleagues, and dialogue partners share their personal experiences and insights working with him, and where their special relationship led them in their life and work. We started this series with three special minds, great friends of Francisco, the Dalai Lama on June 9th, Evan Thompson on June 14th, and John Kabat-Zinn on September 9th. Today, we continue this series with a really special and dear friend of Mind and Life Europe, honorary board member, Roshi Joan Halifax. The title of her talk and discussion will be Continuous Groundlessness, Continuous Discovery, Meeting Francisco in Practice. Roshi is a Buddhist teacher, anthropologist, and author. She is co-founder of the Mind and Life Institute, founded the Ojai Foundation, the Prajna Mountain Buddhist Order, is abbot and head teacher of Upaya Zen Center, and co-founder of the Zen Peacemaker Order. She is a pioneer in the end-of-life care field and is well known internationally for her work in engaged Buddhism. She was an honorary research fellow at Harvard University and a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress. Thank you, Roshi, for joining us today and accepting our invitation to share your experiences and wisdom working with Francisco.
Thank you so much, Gabor.
I would also like to introduce, I would also like to introduce Amy Cohen-Varela, the chair of the Mind and Life Europe board. She is also a clinical psychologist specialized in psychodynamic therapy and philosophy. Amy studied comparative literature at Brown and Columbia universities before moving to Paris in the early 80s, where she received her degree in clinical psychology. She is going to be our co-host today. I would also like to introduce Martin van Beek, who is member of Mind and Life Europe, an associate professor of anthropology in the Institute of Culture and Society at Aarhus University in Denmark. His current research explores the meeting ground between contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, consciousness research, and modernity. Matt Hein will be Roshi's dialogue partner, conversational partner tonight, going through really interesting points and questions. And I would also like to introduce Geneviève Hamelé, president of the Association for the Development of Mindfulness in France. She is deeply connected to our work on Mind and Life Europe, offering MBSR trainings, practicing mindfulness meditation for more than 30 years in traditional settings, and translating Dharma teachers for more than 20 years. She's going to translate Roshi's talk into French. So if you haven't joined the French interpretation channel, you can still do that. So thank you all, and thank you, Roshi, for accepting this invitation. It's a really wonderful moment for us to have you here at the Mind and Life Europe community, and also together with everyone who joined us today. Thank you for participating. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Gabor, thank you so much. And Amy, and also I see many friends of mine, old friends, are gathered here today. You know, in preparation for this talk and thinking about Mind and Life and its roots, I feel that the most important aspect of Mind and Life is how Francisco embodied in his life, in his work, in his very disposition, the disciplines of neuroscience, the practice and view of Buddhism, and also of Western philosophy. But also present was his great humanity. And also this sense of the relationship between justice and compassion. I think this deeply was reflected, this world of justice, the interconnection between justice and compassion, justice and love, was deeply reflected in his response to the revolution in Chile, but which he carried throughout all of his life. And over the years, I saw that Francisco's blazing mind, his warm heart, and his courage magnetize His Holiness's enthusiasm for Mind and Life's vision and for Mind and Life's mission. You know, my sense is that the trust that they shared, their deep respect for each other, their affection for each other, and their mutual sense of discovery is really what brought life to Mind and Life. So I wanted to share a little bit about some of the background of Mind and Life's history. Cisco and I were friends through the marvelous experience of being fellows in the Lindisfarne Association that was founded by William Irwin Thompson, Evan Thompson's father. There I met Ev and so many others that would touch my life and deeply influence my way of thinking. In 1981, our paths crossed during a science and humanities meeting in Cadiz, Spain. And it was not surprising that our conversation around the Dharma and around science took on real life. Certainly, I could feel, and I think Francisco as well, that the spirit of Lindisfarne was very present in those animated exchanges as we were exploring the interface between Buddhism and science. And not so long after that, Francisco and I again crossed paths, and this was at Stanford University in this really groundbreaking or historical meeting on systems theory. The meeting was called Order and Disorder, and it featured economist Kenneth Arrow, chemist Ilya Prigogine, and of course, Francisco. And this was an interdisciplinary conference. And though more formal than what we did in Lindisfarne, the meeting had some of that interdisciplinary spirit of inquiry that Lindisfarne embodied. So I think you're getting a feeling of how important the Lindisfarne Fellowship was for Francisco, also for me, and also how it informed what was to become Mind and Life. Now, during our time at Stanford, Cisco and I explored how interesting it would be to bring together neuroscientists with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in a kind of interdisciplinary dialogue. And that discussion was to go on for quite a few years. Now, I think many of you know Francisco was a student of Tibetan Buddhism. I was a Zen person. But His Holiness, whom I had actually met around the same time that I met Francisco, and one of maybe the earliest meeting, which was at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where His Holiness came and talked. You know, His Holiness was very present in our lives at this time. So in 1983, Cisco came to Ojai after I had had eye surgery. My eyes had been damaged by radiation, and I was in eye bandages for several months. And I was actually scheduled to participate in a small science meeting at the University of California in Santa Barbara with His Holiness, but I was pretty sure I wouldn't go because of my medical condition. But the meeting was small, and Cisco said, you should really go. And if you have the chance, explore this idea of a dialogue between neuroscientists and His Holiness. So at the conclusion of the Santa Barbara meeting, I was very fortunate that His Holiness invited me to have an audience with him. And it was during this private encounter that the dialogue's proposal unfolded. And His Holiness was so positive about the idea. And needless to say, when later I was to contact Cisco, he was super delighted, as was I. And it wasn't long after that Francisco connected with His Holiness at a conference in Alpbach in Austria and made the proposal. And also the response was really wonderful. But, you know, it wasn't so easy organizing things with His Holiness in that time, and it's probably not so easy now. And in '85, I was contacted by an associate in San Francisco about two businessmen in the Bay Area who were proposing dialogues with His Holiness around physics. And so I invited Francisco to join Michael Saltman, who was a businessman who knew His Holiness, and Adam Engel to meet with Cisco and me at the Ojai Foundation. And they, Michael and Adam really resonated with what we were proposing, and they were really interested in collaborating on this project. Michael would eventually drop out of the picture, and I had a lot of fun and a lot of learning as I supported Cisco and Adam as a friend and advisor in the early years of Mind and Life. And I think many of you know the first dialogues were in 1987. And then in 1992, I had the opportunity to go to Dharamsala and present my own work on dying to His Holiness, thanks to Cisco and also to Dan Goldman. And then in 2001, Cisco died. And I really wanted to do my best to support Cisco's vision, to support his ethics and his interests regarding mind and life. And Adam was to invite me to join the board, and so I was deeply involved with many aspects of the organization until 2017. And as Amy knows, I have been so grateful to serve on Mind and Life's board, not only the Mind and Life International, but Mind and Life Europe's board. And to be close to Amy and to our European colleagues. And it was really a marvelous experience as I saw the Mind and Life Europe organization unfolding and blooming. You know, one thing I want to say is that Cisco's vision for Mind and Life was really radical from the very beginning. You know, on one hand, Mind and Life presented a rare opportunity for very rich and spontaneous exchanges between His Holiness in relation to scientists and what they were presenting, and really importantly, philosophers. And Cisco's approach, a very unique approach, included this which he instantiated into the Mind and Life field, emphasize exploration, inquiry, a kind of unfolding or explication of embodied philosophy. And I believe that Cisco's practice as a Buddhist informed his vision and his approach to science. You know, in the end, he definitely was not neurocentric. not materialistic or reductionistic. And he also saw mind and life as a kind of dream board, to quote him, a place where radical ideas about the nature of mind and reality could be challenged and could be unfolded. Now, recently, a friend reminded me of a comment that Cisco made in Ojai in 1984. And it's sort of typical of Francisco. The comment is, what happens when there are no reference points left? I mean, we can ask ourselves right now, what happens when there are no reference points left? You know, and recently when I was asking about mind and life's future, I personally had to reply, I don't know. And I think my response was congruent with Cisco's view of life as a path of discovery. All reference points disappearing into a landscape of surprise. In other words, and we've heard this, these words often in relation to Francisco as he's translated these words from a poem by Juan Ramon Jimenez, laying down a path while walking. You know, I think this is one of the reasons why Cisco was so drawn to Buddhism and to contemplative practice. As he and Amy once said, the most powerful laboratory was between the ears. You know, I was fortunate in this regard to share practice with Francisco at various times and in various schools of Buddhism. And just for example, right now I'm remembering the sesshin, this meditation intensive we did with the Korean Zen master Sonsanim. It caused us no end of mutual merriment. The Korean forms were not at all familiar to Cisco, and to him, and maybe a little bit to me. They seemed a bit bizarre. But also, I think Cisco got it. It really, from what I could sense in the context of his experience of practice within this highly structured situation, he seemed to actually drop into deep states in this very tough schedule that we were subjected to. And though I think Zen wasn't his thing, he seemed to be able to relate to Zen from the Dzogchen point of view. And we also both had time with Orgyen Tulku at Nagi Gompa in Kathmandu. I was headed out to the mountains to do a nomad's clinic, and fortunately, Francisco happened to be in Kathmandu at the same time. And I have to say that sitting with Dharma friends in this high Gompa overlooking Kathmandu Valley as this seemingly very ordinary man with thick glasses opined on emptiness, it was illuminating and surprising, always. And the silence in and around all of us in Rinpoche's presence was really palpable. And then there was southern France and the Dordogne, which was a kind of refuge for him. At one point I was in Plum Village practicing with Thich Nhat Hanh, and I would occasionally visit La Sonnerie, where Cisco was practicing with His Holiness Khensi Rinpoche and other tulkus. And clearly he loved his Tibetan teachers, and he gave himself over to devotional and deep practice that I felt plunged him into the territory of groundlessness. And I think as he was moving into the increasing groundlessness of the dying process, his practice served him well. And so did his Tibetan teachers, and so did Amy. You know, I felt it was always so rich to have the opportunity to be in special practice situations with Cisco. But one of the things that I remember most is the sense of the continuous practice that he brought into all of his life, in the way that he saw the world, in the way that he enacted his relationships. And that the sensibility was accompanied by a kind of groundlessness, a kind of not knowing, of radical openness and inclusiveness. And that's why I'm calling this little talk today, Continuous Groundlessness, Continuous Discovery. Now, Amy recently shared a quote from Cisco that truly caught my attention, as for me at least, it reflected what I was to discover about compassion, a process that I was have been very deeply involved in investigating for many years. And I felt it was very close to Francisco's values and his heart, in terms of how he carried out his neuroscience research and his political engagement and also his Buddhist practice. And the quote is, "It should not be surprising that one of the main characteristics of spontaneous compassion, which is not a characteristic of volitional action based on habitual patterns, is that it follows no rules." So I'd like to read those words again, because I want to unpack them a little bit, or try to. It should not be surprising that one of the main characteristics of spontaneous compassion, which is not a characteristic of volitional action based on habitual patterns, is that it follows no rules. As you can imagine, Cisco's view that compassion is spontaneous and not based on volitional action grounded in habitual patterns, and that compassion follows no rules, it makes utter sense to me. You know, I read these words and a big smile broke out on my face. Yes, I said exactly, and so very Cisco. So I'll try to explain a little bit why I smiled. And I want to thank Evan Thompson for his new article, Living Ways of Sense-Making, which after I had put this talk together, I read the article, and it was it was very dense and brilliant. And I'm sure I'll have to read it many more times in order to digest it. But it's definitely in resonance with what I want to share in the next few minutes. And I want to say, forgive me, I am not a scientist. At this point of my life, and for the past 50 years, I've been a Buddhist practitioner with some sidelines. So maybe I'm just going to make a little bit of confusion out of this brief analysis of compassion. So I urge you, please be patient with me. And in the end, maybe you won't hesitate to clarify some of the perspectives or ideas that I'm proposing. And I also want to say that I was so fortunate some years ago to be appointed as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress. And I had for many years served dying people and trained healthcare workers in care of the dying. And I was, over the years, becoming increasingly aware of what would be called compassion deficit, a kind of serious deficit of compassion in medical care, and the effects not only on patients, but also on clinicians, and as well on the institutions in which clinicians serve. So this time in the library was dedicated to endeavoring to synthesize what I had learned about compassion from the work in neuroscience, from the work in social psychology, and I think Mind and Life for being exposed to this work, from Francisco, of course, from my own experience in the end-of-life care field, and as a contemplative. And what I wanted to do was to find a better way to train clinicians and healthcare workers in compassion. And I realized in order to do this, I had to really understand what compassion was. So while I was in the wonderful embrace of the library in DC, over many months, I developed a heuristic map of compassion. And now, most of us know that compassion has been defined in this way. The emotion one experiences when feeling concern for another's suffering and desiring to enhance that person's welfare. Now, from this somewhat narrow definition, we can surmise that compassion has two main components: the affective feeling of caring for one who's suffering and the motivation to relieve suffering. And what I want to suggest is that this conventional definition of compassion might have limitations. And these limitations are pointed out in the words from Cisco that I just shared. So let's look at it this way. If one considers, as Cisco suggests, that compassion is spontaneous, meaning unprescribed, and also from my point of view, it seems to be a process that is contingent, that is emergent, and as Francisco has suggested, fundamentally unpredictable, that it's embedded in situatedness, it's context dependent, and it's not a discrete internal feature that can be trained like a muscle is trained. And from this point of view, we might consider that compassion is inactive. And then to further elaborate, again, just from my perspective, I believe that compassion is a braided or networked process that is grounded or embedded in interrelationality, in mutuality, in non-explicit reciprocity, and adaptivity. It is fully context dependent, and as well as, I hope Ev would agree, it is related to sense making. So, as we know, our good friend, philosopher Evan Thompson has written extensively about the inactive view, and this is what I'm trying to use in relation to compassion. So the inactive view posits that all living beings are fundamentally sense-making creatures. These beings enact or bring forth meaning in their intimate interactions with their environments. So this term inaction was originally proposed by Cisco, Ev, and Eleanor Roshi, and they defined it thus, though I'm aware that inaction is being further elucidated, further unpacked by Ev, Ezekiel Di Paolo, Hannah de Jager, and others today. But for today, let's just sit with this definition. A living organism enacts the world it lives in. Its embodied action in the world constitutes its perception and thereby grounds its cognition. So from this perspective, compassion can be seen, or perhaps can be seen, as an emergent process in a dynamic, adaptive, and also, to use the word in Ev's article, which is, I think, a wonderful word, the precarious relationship between mind, body, and the lived environment. As Cisco has suggested, and I deeply agree, compassion is spontaneous. It is non-algorithmic, or it's completely unprescribed. And as Cisco says, compassion does not follow rules. It arises spontaneously from the ground of interrelated attentional, somatosensory, and cognitive processes that are embedded and responsive to context or situatedness. And its emergence as well engenders sense-making through fundamental openness, or this experience of unfilteredness, and engagement through being in resonance with the so-called external world. In other words, as Ev might describe this, compassion is a process of participatory sense-making. Perhaps we can even say that a subject who is compassionate enacts the world he or she is embedded in. And this world, of course, reflects social, ethical, and political values. And that combination actually elicit and shape the emergence and expression of compassion. Now, I want to say a few things about the Buddhist perspective on compassion. And I'm going to specifically reference the work of the 14th century great Zen teacher, gardener, master, Muso Soseki. But also this is reflected in the Vajrayana perspective, that compassion has three valences. And the first is common or referential compassion. And this is compassion in relation to a so-called object of suffering, usually someone or a situation that's characterized as an in-group person or being, or in a context actually of familiarity. And so most of us experience compassion toward those whom we share close connection. Our parents, our children, the spouse, the lover, our siblings, our teammates, our pets, and maybe even that old tree in the yard. And we also tend to feel compassion more readily for those in our own culture or ethnic group. And we also can feel a strong connection with those who've suffered in ways that we ourselves have also experienced. Like, for example, in my own situation, whenever I encounter a blind person, something leaps up in me. There's a kind of resonance as I perceive a person who can't see because of the issues with my eyes over the years. And referential compassion can also extend beyond the circle of our familiars and even include those we don't know. For example, victims of sexual violence or police violence, those who are unsheltered or refugees, but we feel some kind of empathic resonance with those individuals or that situation, those situations. So this is so-called compassion with an object, or referential compassion. And then there's insight-based compassion, which is ethically and dharmically grounded. And Soseki writes about insight-based compassion. And this is a concept that also exists within Tibetan Buddhism. And this kind of compassion is more conceptual, but also points towards some kind of realization. From Soseki's perspective, this focuses on the realization of the truth of impermanence and of dependent co-arising. And from my perspective, as a contemplative and as a caregiver, insight-based compassion also encompasses the understanding that compassion is a kind of ethical imperative. That is, turning away from suffering can have negative consequences for self, for other, and for society, and the world, really, our environment. So, for example, when we see someone in need, ideally, we feel in a spontaneous way compelled to act. We don't just walk by. We don't feel indifferent or consumed by a kind of addictive moral apathy. There's the sense of responding compassionately to suffering. It's just the right thing to do, as a kind of affirmation of respect and of human dignity. And still in this second category of compassion that Soseki has articulated in the 14th century, there's still a self and there's still an other. There's still referential compassion. But here, compassion is becoming more context dependent. Now, there's a third form of compassion that Soseki articulates, and this is non-referential or universal compassion. And that is fundamentally compassion without an object. And Soseki points out that this third category of compassion is actually what is genuine compassion, as it's a kind of continuous, unfolding, responsive process in our lived, contextually embedded experience. And I believe that this is what Sisko was referring to in the quote that I shared earlier: a spontaneous, non-volitional response to suffering, with no thought to self or other, or for that matter, even to ethics. Though we could say that the outcome is ethical. But as in the Blue Cliff Record and one Zen koan puts it, it's like adjusting our pillow at night. So in my own work, what I've tentatively called inactive compassion, I've isolated interdependent modes that appear to braid or to actually prime and optimize the emergence of compassion. And I articulated or identified these modes because, as I said earlier, I wanted to find a way to train people in compassion and discover that compassion is actually composed of non-compassion elements. And those elements are actually trainable. So those elements include attention and attentional balance, as well as prosocial affect, like concern and caring, and also altruistic intention, very important. Also, there's a cognitive domain related to unprescribed insight. And there's an embodied and engaged process that actually when this suite of features comes together, all of this primes an ethical and engaged response to the presence of suffering in relation to our lived and embedded experience in this moment and in the world. So what I'm humbly suggesting is that compassion might be considered an emergent process arising out of the interaction of a number of interdependent somatic, affective, cognitive, attentional, and embodied processes unfolding in the context of our whole and situated lived experience. That there's no compassion without attentional and affective balance. Compassion is not possible without there's a kind of instantiated altruistic intention and natural unmediated wisdom. And that compassion is an embodied, embedded, and engaged process that is enacted in the world and is spontaneous and is fundamentally unprescribed. So why do I sense that the inactive view might be important in relation to understanding compassion? You know, many consider compassion from the neurocentric perspective, like where it shows up, lights up in the brain, or from a religious perspective, or ethical perspective, or psychological perspective. But I have a hunch that the inactive view might suggest that compassion can be seen as an unprescribed process about sense-making in our lives and in the world. And the inactive view in relation to compassion can be, just brings so much depth to our understanding of our own response to suffering, not as some kind of neurosingularity or psychological moment or as a social imperative, but truly as a sense-making process that is a rich and woven, or gives rise, if you will, to this sort of richly woven fabric that unfolds and folds itself moment after moment in our full and inclusive lived experience. So I want to thank Cisco and Ev and Bill Thompson, Amy, Mind and Life, Al Kaznak, the Klugis for funding my time at the library, and really so many others for support of this exploration of compassion. And of course, I really am so indebted to Francisco, whose life was a reflection of what it means to truly care for the world. And I apologize for stretching an action this way and that, and I hope you understand what I'm suggesting. And maybe we can return to Francisco's words as I finish this exploration. It should not be surprising that one of the main characteristics of spontaneous compassion, which is not a characteristic of volitional action based on habitual patterns, is that it follows no rules. So thank you.
Thank you, Roshi. I would like to ask our special guest, Matt Tyne, from Mind and Life Europe, also to share maybe further reflections and maybe questions after your really deep and beautiful and very intimate and personal sharing, Roshi. Thank you so much. We will have time for other questions from the audience as well. But first, I would like to ask Matt Tyne.
Thank you, Gabor, and thank you, Roshi. That was so rich and moving, very thought-provoking also. what I would like to do is to see if we could go and talk a little bit more about what you were just talking about compassion. And Francisco wrote this small book that came out of a couple of talks called Ethical Know-How, where he emphasizes this point of the spontaneity of true compassionate action, true ethical action. And of course, the capacity is innate in sentient beings like ourselves, but it needs to be cultivated. And one of the things that's been striking to me is reading about the ways in which Francisco Varela brought this into the way in which, of course, what he was studying, but also how he was working with his students. So Amy shared this interview that Philip Clayton did with Francisco that was published a number of years ago, where he talks about his lab and how in the lab he tried to bring this into practice. And we've heard from Antoine Lutz, one of his PhD students, that wasn't indeed a very palpable quality that was present in his lab. Now, I see in the audience during this live stream is Wolfgang Lucas, among others, who is one of the people involved in an initiative that Mind and Life Europe is also very happy with, called Mindful Researchers, where young people, young academics are trying to discuss and support each other the challenges of trying to walk these two paths in a way, the path of spiritual practice and the path of science, which in modern careers can be very, very challenging. And we know from the interview that was published by Franz Reichler with Francisco that he himself was grappling with this challenge. And I have a small quote that I would love to read and as a way of opening up this topic and get back to your own work, Roshi. It's a quote from an interview that was done with Francisco in the context of a meeting that took place in Amsterdam in 1990 called Art Meets Science and Spirituality in a Changing Economy. It's one that I like to use. It's called, what he says is, he talks about the relationship between science and spirituality. And he says, I don't think one can ever say that science and spirituality should be together. I would rather say that spirituality is a kind of perspective that pervades every human activity. Mm-hmm. And if science is not able to live within that ecology, there is something wrong with science. I don't believe that intrinsically there is a problem. It is only when science takes itself to be the high priest of knowledge and pontificates that there is a problem. But in fact, the best science is not like that. So what I would love to hear your reflections on is this tension that many younger academics in particular experience of how to balance their spiritual longings and the need to develop these inner qualities on the one hand, and on the other hand, the work of being an academic and being in science. So I know that at Fire Institute, you've held quite a few meetings with Evan Thompson and John and Richie Davidson and so on, continuing the work of the dialogue. How is your personal experience with this? You have an academic background as well, as you've just demonstrated so eloquently. How have you dealt with this tension, and what kind of advice would you have to share maybe with students out there, early career practitioners about this challenge?
So, from the Buddhist perspective, and I think the Buddhist perspective on the relationship between wisdom and compassion is a kind of interesting model. In other words, these two expressions that are so important in our lives, what is it to be a compassionate person? What is it to be a wise person? Are seen from the point of view of interdependence, or, if you will, two sides of the same coin. And I feel that I remember at a Mind and Life Summer Research meeting many years ago, a young neuroscientist said, well, why bother with spirituality? And I think many of us realized in that very question was that he didn't really understand the value of cultivating a perspective internally, which was unfiltered, which was open, which was inclusive, which didn't necessarily find itself embedded in the data of the moment. But it had to do with, again, going back to that beautiful sentence from the poem by Jimenez that Cisco translated, laying down a path and walking. And I feel like, I mean, I don't know anything about Einstein. You know, he was across the valley during, in my neighborhood, so to speak. But I feel like the really great scientists had that very open, inclusive quality. And I'm thinking about a quote from Suzuki Roshi, who said, you know, in the expert's mind, there are very few options, but in the beginner's mind, there are many.
Right.
And so, you know, I think a great scientist, and I feel that Francisco was that. And, you know, the community that we're all a part of in Mind and Life. We share this common sensibility of openness, inclusivity. We work with our biases. We work with those tendencies to the greatest extent possible. And that is, I think, part of the work of being, you know, a practitioner, but of also of being a good scientist.
Right.
Being open to surprise.
Yeah. Great.
Does that make sense to you, Martin?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, no, that's great. You know, the relationship between the scientific endeavor and Buddhism, the practice side, so to speak, what one sometimes hears from people, I've heard it from many people at least, is a sense of you know, of this tension. So in one person, there can be a tension between should I do one thing or another, but also people in the different camps, like you just illustrated, with somebody saying, well, you know, why do we need to bother with the spirituality? And in a way, you know, a practitioner might say, why do we need to bother with the science? You know, from a proper Gelug monk perspective, it's a waste of time, because, you know, you should just be studying the really important text that one should be, you know, the philosophical text that one should be studying. Francisco, I read in maybe in the same interview, talked about science as his Trojan horse, in a way, that he used it as a way to bring the importance of practice to the attention of people, and that science was in a way a necessary element in that also. So he really argued for he said that it was really important to bring it back into education, you know, contemplative practice, and of course this is one of the activities that Mind and Life Institute and also Mind and Life Europe is also engaged with. But for some people, there is it's seen as a problem that science, you know, as the quote from Francisco that I mentioned earlier stated, that science has a tendency to pontificate and make itself the arbiter of what is true and meaningful. And of course, from a practice perspective, it would look very different. Can you say something in how in your view, this relationship in practice functions? So to what extent, maybe in your own experience, or how do you see science and scientific research informing our understanding of practice, and vice versa? How does practice actually inform the science that we do? What do you think?
So this is actually, it's a kind of weave of many questions.
Yes, sorry.
I'll opine on whichever ones I can remember. You know, as you might have gathered from my explorations of the landscape of compassion, science was very useful for me. In other words, the work in neuroscience, the work in social psychology really was inspiring, but also helped me structure this heuristic map and also the interventions that I teach in relation to the cultivation of compassion. So it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater at all, but it's to understand why do we practice? is it just a self-improvement program, or are we practicing one with this kind of altruistic or instantiated altruistic motivation to be of service to others and not to create a club or a cult where we become stupider and stupider, if you will? And I can only speak from my perspective, and I am probably the worst example of this one could ever imagine. But hopefully what a deep practice does is to familiarize oneself with one's mental continuum, the contents of consciousness, if you will, and to do that in a way that allows one to drop through, if you will, the psychomental or cognitive contents to a place that is radically open. And so we're going back a little bit to what I was speaking about earlier, that the biases that are at the preconscious level in our subjective experience distort our perception of reality. And it's those distortions, I believe, that really feed not only suffering, but lead to ethical crises in the pursuit of science.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that was really wonderful to hear your responses. I think maybe we should open it up for questions, Gabor, if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Matt, for these first questions. I would really like to invite everyone present here to think more and ask questions, either in person, just sending us a signal, or in the chat. In the meantime, while waiting for some of those questions, I would like to ask one, Roshi. You used this very interesting term, continuous groundlessness, in the title of your talk. How do you see these two terms interacting with each other? Groundlessness on the one hand, which means probably some momentariness of experience, and emptiness in another way, and continuity, that this form of experiencing is still continuous or continuously maintained, or invites us to maybe a program of practice or a program of a certain way of living, not just spontaneously moment by moment, but also having a trajectory leading us from a moment to somewhere in the future. So how do you see the interplay between these two facets of reality, momentariness, groundlessness, and continuity?
So, there's a point in our experience of practice, but also of reality, where the reference points drop away. And what we come into contact with is what Dogen calls uji, or time being. It's the conflation, or the simultaneous realization of groundlessness in this moment that actually is abiding. And this is, from the point of view of lived experience, it's underneath it all, if you will. And our reference points tend to, and our preferences tend to narrow our world. And this also goes in relation to science. Science is a way to, we can begin to identify a landscape, to quantify it, to investigate it, to validate it. But what we see just in terms of the organization of a cell, which is so fascinating, is that in a certain way, there is no end to the anatomy of that cell. The deeper we go, we keep moving through these landscapes that drop away, and it's groundless. It's groundless. It's groundless. So I believe, from the point of view of practice, this is a lived experience. In other words, I don't expect that this realization which is something that we would call gives rise to wisdom. You know, there are smart people and there are wise people. There's kind of a difference between those categories. You know, that a wise person has this fearlessness, a sensibility of radical inclusivity, not operating out of preferential mind, not attached to outcomes, and so forth. So I think it's, at the deepest level, that continuity is there, and it's for us to actually access that continuity through perhaps the medium of practice, but also, you know, in a moment, you see it. And in Zen, we call that the taste that turns you around. Suddenly your view of reality shifts, and it is in your direct experience. But it's also something that is not accessible at the level of concepts or, you know, conventional descriptions.
Thank you, Roshi. It means that there is some accumulation of experience and maybe meaning in the process of discontinuity. So,
well, also disaccumulation. You know, that's, I mean, I think it's kind of, it's sort of yes, and sort of, it's a letting go of all the reference points. You know, it's not that I feel that, you know, data isn't delightful or interesting or useful. You know, I'm very grateful that this vaccine has been developed so I, as an old person, can sit, you know, with you today and not succumb to what's happening with this pandemic. So I just, you know, science has saved my life, not just one time. On the other hand, the conversation, if you will, between, which I think Mind and Life exemplifies, our lived experience between our embeddedness in emptiness, if you will, this continuous groundlessness, and the investigation of phenomena. And it's like a dance that we're in.
Thank you, Roshi. I would like to ask Catherine Godman Schuiler. You are raising your hand if you want to ask your question, and I saw some others in the chat already, so more are coming. Catherine.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's see if I can. Thank you, Roshi, and thank you, Mind and Life Europe, for this wonderful opportunity. The experience of groundlessness, from the little I have of it, seems like it can either generate fear or compassion. So I'm really interested, I know you've worked with this both at the conceptual and practical level. I see that shift of going from it generating fear to generating wisdom and compassion being so important for leaders around the world. And yet their experience of time seems to be that they don't have time for the kind of deep practice, I think, most of them, that seems to enable that shift to compassion rather than fear with the groundlessness. It seems to me a lot of people experience a kind of groundlessness that they don't know what to do with today. So I'd love your thoughts on that, and perhaps the role of science and maybe the arts in that process.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. It's wonderful you mentioned the arts in this regard, because I think that is an important path of discovery. So, you know, the fear around groundlessness, you know, losing all reference points, I wish I could pull out of my mind this wonderful quote by Trungpa Rinpoche. You know, you're falling, but there's nothing you're going to hit. You know, you're groundless. And so much of that aversion toward groundlessness or clinging to reference points is really about the need to define and defend the self. And the deeper you look as a scientist and as a practitioner into the nature of reality, you realize that what we have defined in terms of the small self, or our gender, ethnicity, our neighborhood, our corner of the world. We're moving into a very different experience to recognize what is called paratantra, interconnectedness, interdependence, and interpenetration. That we're not separate from each other. And we just see it in terms of the pandemic and climate change. I mean, boy, we're in a groundless situation, but we're also, hyper connected. And I'm not talking about Zoom. We just see cause and effect right before our very eyes, interconnection in our lived experience, and it's embedded. It's the whole earth, and it's frightening, but also it puts things in perspective. And I believe it engenders a natural ethics.
Thank you, Roshi. I can also see Ronald Alexander. You also posted a question, but you can with yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Roshi Joan.
Nice to see you.
Lovely lecture. Do you see any difference between empathy and compassion? And if so, could you articulate if there are differences, or are they one and the same?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Ron. Empathy and compassion are often conflated. So actually, I've written a lot about this in my book, Standing at the Edge. The whole chapter on empathy kind of goes into making that distinction. And just briefly, and some people see it a little bit differently, so I want to make that clear. This is just a perspective that I think is shared by some of our colleagues in neuroscience. Actually, somebody, my good friend Wendy said, the Trumper and Pache, the bad news is you're falling through the air, nothing to hang on to, no parachute. The good news is there's no ground. So anyway, to go back to empathy and compassion. So I think the conflation of empathy and compassion is kind of an interesting area to explore. And I look at empathy as this experience of resonance where one expands one's subjectivity to include the somatic, perhaps the affective, perhaps the cognitive experience of another. And we certainly know it. I know that, in the Nomads Clinic, when I see certain medical procedures happening, I have a somatic response that is very, sometimes dramatic. In terms of affective resonance, the experience of bearing witness to a grieving mother and the grief invoked in me. And Nancy, this is the work of Nancy Eisenberg and Dan Batson. This kind of affective resonance is what we know as empathy. And also cognitive resonance, where we begin to, quote, see out of the so-called eyes, but more view the world out of others' perspective. And this, kind of happened in the Second World War, when wonderful Germans became not so wonderful, began to see the world through the eyes of Hitler. And in Japan and in our country as well, we see the same kind of thing. Views that aren't necessarily native to an individual, but in a social context are taken on because of there's a field of resonance. And that experience is an experience of vicariousness. Whereas compassion, I see as involving the following features: the actual capacity to attend to the experience of another, the experience of another causing concern in us with the aspiration to, end that suffering, to have the kind of discernment to be able to ascertain what might serve the ending of suffering, and then some embodied response. And there can be compassion without much empathy. And empathy can also, and I really appreciate the work here of Mathieu Ricard and Tanya Singer in making this distinction between empathy and compassion. I share the anecdote in my book, Standing at the Edge, where Mathieu was asked to actually empathize with a group of, on something with something. And he had seen a video produced by the BBC, as I recall, of orphans in Eastern Europe, these kids who were so physically and psychically fragile, and he was just in that resonance experience with them. And when he was in the scanner, he focused on these fragile children and was very aroused and experienced what Batson has called empathic distress. And when he came out of the scanner, I guess Tanya asked him, well, do you want to continue working in terms of the attunement process of empathy, or would you like to practice compassion? And Mathieu, who was kind of drained, said, I'll go for compassion. And it's not that compassion dissociates, but compassion is really coming from a ground of wisdom. I also say a world without empathy is a world where we are dead to each other. So it's not to say empathy is a bad thing. But as Batson and Eisenberg suggest, the regulation of our empathic response is really important. And I've seen that to be the case as someone who's been in healthcare situations for almost 50 years. I guess I want to say one more thing. I have too many things to say about it. Let's go on to other questions, but thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Joan.
Thank you. Amy asked the question in the chat. May I read it, Amy, or you would like to raise it yourself?
Well, thank you.
Yeah, please,
you could read it. It just followed up on Roshi's comment about the view from the compassionate, or the view from groundlessness is turning your mind around. It was that phrase, turning your mind around, that captured me. So I was thinking about Mind and Life Europe and how we've been using an action as kind of a guideline for how our organization works or tries to work in the best possible way. So in some ways, we're using a scientific idea to applying it to ourselves as an organization, or we're doing this experiment anyway, and it's extremely interesting, working with values and this sort of thing. So I wonder, when you say the inactive view, do you see it really as a view, like you could talk about view in the terms of Dharma?
Well, I think Dharma is a trap, if you will. I could call it the view from nowhere, which is kind of a sort of controversial thing to say, but that's what I mean. Actually, the word Dharma is kind of interesting. It comes from the same root as truth and tree, and it refers to that which is firmly established. And we're not talking about the phenomenal world in this case. That which is firmly established from the perspective of my club, the Buddhist club, is the truth of emptiness. And how you get there, I'm still working on that process.
Actually, Wolfgang has posted Wolfgang Lucas, a longer message in the chat, which relates to elaborating this question that Martijn and Amy asked too. So I would like to ask you, Wolfgang, to ask your question or read it out and elaborate it a little bit further, because I think you are referring to an important point here. And I'm sure Roshi will have more to say.
Hey, thank you, Gabor. I hope I can ask the question in a simple enough way. I was, there was about the tension between science and practice that Martijn has spoken to, and in some way Amy has pointed to also. I was wondering if there is some way in which, rather than thinking about it as a tension, although it's very compelling, that there's some kind of just relaxing into, it's really, I don't know how I can say it easily, something about the inactive view, but not as an idea, as a philosophical stance, but just to make somehow a very simple gesture to each other as we're doing science, as we're cultivating a relationship with each other. That, I don't know, kind of, that the problem disappears in a way. But what it might require is that there are people who are doing this together. I mean, you can do it alone, but it's a little bit difficult perhaps. But if you're in an environment where several people are leaning together into such a gesture, the tension between science and practice, or some other work and practice, might just, I don't know, vanish, disappear in some way. I don't know if this makes any sense, but maybe you can respond to that in some way. Thank you.
I think you're intuitively answering the question. You know, I feel it in your body, if you will, as you're, it's not a reconciliation. Again, it's like this experience. I love that you said it's a relaxation. It's a letting go. It's not needing to stand within the preferences and reference points that reify the small self and also create a fear-filled world. But it's a world that instead is emergent and characterized, as we experience, as one that has engendered within us curiosity.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this hits the nail on the head. Or, yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful question. I feel it in your body.
I do so too. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
As these last few questions showed, it's not easy to grasp the embodied meaning of the term enaction. This is not, as Wolfgang mentioned, a philosophy, or it's not a theory in itself. It's a practice. It's a way of being. It's an embodied experience, as Roshi explained it so beautifully in her talk. So if I can just ask one more question around that, when it comes to an action, an active view, an active approach, it's so difficult to explain it to people who have not studied the philosophy or the embodied mind book that Francisco and Evan wrote together. And even the term there is not developed so extensively. So we are left with our own understanding and our own imagination and our own experience and practice around the notion of an action. So I would like to ask you, Roshi, if you needed to explain it in, let's say, a few words. You did that in your talk, but if you needed to explain it in a spontaneous, groundless, non-philosophical way, what would you say? What an action is?
Oh, Gabor.
Sorry for that.
So I'll just use a few terms that Ev is very familiar with. It's embodied, it's embedded, and it's in our moment-to-moment, unpredictable lived experience, in context, in situatedness, in this movement, an emergence of sense-making. And Ev refers to it as participatory sense-making. It's this, the surprise, if you will. It's like, who knew? None of us actually knew. You know, we're in an emergent surprise. The truth of impermanence prevails. And out of that, this sense of groundlessness. And as Wendy, who shared the Trump Rinpoche's wonderful quote, surprise, there's no ground underneath you, even as you're falling.
Thank you.
And pardon my primitive response.
No, it was not. It was actually very, very, very deep and philosophical and concrete, especially that if I understand your understanding well, this means that there is no reference point in our relationship with the world, that we are enacting each other. We are enacting the world is enacting us.
That's right.
And there is no stable, fixed point of reference where we could start with, either within ourselves or with somewhere outside in the world, or somewhere with a dogma or with an absolute truth expressed by one person, that we co-creatively participate in this journey of sense making. And we are co-creatively and co-actively or actively creating this together. We cannot separate ourselves from each other and from the world, and the world can just simply be there outside without us either. So it's a mutuality.
It's mutuality, and it's also, I think, it really ends this notion of prediction.
Yes, precariousness in a way.
I love that term, which Evan used in this article I cited.
Thank you, Roshi. I see
Thank you so much.
One last question from Andreas Andreu. If I may invite you to speak, to ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Roshi. Thank you for this. I'm thinking about you say, compassion is made of non-compassionate elements that one can cultivate and train on. So, and there is a lot of programs out there that, for the lack of a better word, sell on training or developing or cultivating compassion. So from a science perspective, that means if there is a process, that dependent variable, which is compassion, that there is an assumption that we can measure the outcome of compassion. And I'm sensing that there is a trap in going down that road. And so how do we engage in compassion and continue developing compassion when the outcome cannot really, it's very fluid. And so how can we know the effect of our actions?
So this is such a wonderful question. And I see Martin put up one of Francisco's term, fragile ontologies. The truth is we can't, as you suggest. And that actually an attachment to outcome is a filter that can actually cause more suffering, as you well know, because you're working at Johns Hopkins in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And so, you see what compassion is from your own lived experience, working in a huge hospital system that is exceedingly fragile at this time, and also where the sense of groundlessness is actually pervading that system in a radical way. So, you answered your question perfectly. And I think it's also a wonderful way to conclude our time together, that this is not just, we're not just talking about concepts. You, as somebody who works in a context of emergent, in an emergent world, in an emergent process, know we cannot control, but the qualities of compassion that we were exploring in understanding that our embeddedness is shaping our response. What is arising in the moment shapes our very response to the presence of suffering.
Thank you,
So
Roshi.
thank you for what you do, Andreas and Gabor and Amy and everybody.
Thank you so much, Roshi, for this wonderful time together. And I would also like to thank Matt Hine from Beck for the dialogue with you, and also for to all of you for participating and following this discussion. If you want to rewatch this discussion, as someone asked in the beginning whether we record it, we did record it and we live streamed on YouTube. You can watch it there again. And I'm just posting the link here. And also, if you want to continue following the work of Mind and Life Europe and these talks, this series and other series we are organizing this fall, please feel free to sign up to our newsletter and receive regular messages, news about our activities. Roshi, once again, I would like to thank you so much. It was such a special experience to spend this evening with you and to hear your memories of spending time with Francisco and working together, thinking together, practicing together, experiencing groundlessness together. This was such a learning for us because we haven't really heard that before. So I think it's nice that we could keep that memory of yours for the digital world as well with the recording. And I would just like to mention that this series is going to continue in a few weeks' time, October 13th. Another great friend of Francisco is actually one of his greatest students, Antoine Lutz and Jean-Philippe Lachaud, will share their Francisco Varela experience with the subtitle, Are You Experienced? They are going to share experiences of working with him and setting up the lab and spending time together, not only with work, but also with life and with their mind. So thank you.
And Gabor also thanks Jean-Pierre for her French translation. So appreciate that. And it was a joy and an honor. And thank you for these very rich questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you,
Thank you,
Genevieve.
Roshi. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Gabor.
So I would like to say goodbye to you all and see you again soon. Thank you.